Getting your PhD in globalist books. A PhD in globalist books, and now it looks like the scientific outlook. Yeah, yeah. You're only gonna get your PhD from me in globalist books. PhD in globalist books. That's what the stash is for. That's what the stash is for. Please say you want more. The stash is for globalist books. Months and months of globalist books to come. Oh yeah. That was all improv. That was all improv. Beautiful singing. The voice. And yes, the stash was improv. I just improvised the stash to come upon my face. We're going to do globalist books as I promised. The first one up, The Scientific Outlook by the great villain himself, Bertrand Russell. This book, now I'd read selections and chapters of this book before, but I had not read the entire book cover to cover. And then when I went and did it, whoa, blown away, man. I mean, get ready. This is next level. Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis said you can get my book Esoteric Hollywood, which actually goes into a lot of this information from a movie standpoint, a lighter perspective. A lot of fun. This book, it now has like 100 5-star reviews. Definitely something that you'll want to check out. Get it directly from Jay's Analysis. So yeah, I finally plowed through Scientific Outlook, and I'm going to plow through The Impact of Science on Society next. We've got a whole stack. We've got a bunch of H.G. Wells books, Jacques Attali. We're going to be dealing with all those in the next several weeks. So this is written in 1931, and again, Russell is known as the foremost logician of the 20th century, which I think is odd, because in many ways he's actually also a propagandist, much like H.G. Wells will be a propagandist for scientism and the dogmas of empiricism, materialism, determinism, etc., etc. So what we're going to do is cover the outline of basics here in this, the hardcore stuff, and then really deep stuff, the in-depth, hardcore, hard-hitting quotes, one after another, in the full audio and video for Jay's Analysis subscribers. And you can subscribe at Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. Also watch my TV show, Hollywood Decoded, which is streaming at the Gaia Network. You can also purchase that from Amazon Prime if you're an Amazon Prime user. So the first thing that's odd about this book is that the introduction, the preface, and the version that I have admits by this character, David Papineau, he admits that this is all based upon the real plans to bring in the Brave New World. The beginning of the philosophy here is atomism and relativism. There's no objective truth. There's only the flux of the external world, and then the interpretation that we impose upon it, which never says anything true about the real world. So pragmatism and relativism are the starting point. The end result is the state. The state becomes God. The state is the arbiter of what's true and what's false. Now, Bertrand Russell will play the liberal, and this is important to understand that he's not an actual liberal. He is very much on board with this plan because he sees it as the natural corollary to evolutionary process. This is very important because we're going to see that for Bertrand Russell, evolution is never clearly defined. It's just as elastic as the science that he proposes. Now, I am 100% pro-science. I did a lot of analytical philosophy in my undergrad and grad school days, and I also enjoyed intensely a lot of the philosophy of science classes I took. So I'm very much a fan of science, and in many ways this is actually a book on the philosophy of science. But the problem is that Russell wants to, with his Royal Society connections, and by the way, he admits that this is admitted that all of modern scientism essentially spews forth from the Royal Society on page 23, where he discusses Charles II. So propaganda is important because what we see is that Russell starts immediately with the Dark Ages, which is a propaganda idea from Voltaire. There were many inventors and philosophers and scientists prior to Voltaire throughout the Middle Ages. So first of all, that's not true. We're told that Galileo, Darwin, Newton, Pavlov, and Freud are the new heroes of the new era. Now, that might be true in a sense in terms of propaganda, but they're not actual heroes because each one of these characters was essentially in many ways propagandized to be the fathers of modernity, and as Russell says explicitly, to destroy older existing cultures, traditions, notions, and ideas. So the modern Anglo and by extension Zionist ideologies are absolutely interested in promoting liberalism, promoting relativism and pragmatism. And that's because they are based on a kind of weird hermeticism. And you find this actually, he will admit that Newton, Kepler, these characters were actually involved in hermeticism. He strangely admits, well, actually doesn't admit that about Newton. He does admit that about Kepler and other characters, that they were influenced by Zoroastrianism in their scientism. Russell will go on to say that he's a huge fan of J.B. Watson and Pavlov, also great heroes of modernity, because they discovered the scientific technique for controlling men and controlling men's minds through operant conditioning and conditioned reflexes. So the dog training, the bell, and so forth, like you experienced in your public school education when the bell rang and told you that it was time to go get your slice of plastic pizza and your milk bag. Maybe you had milk cartons at your school. My school had milk bags, a bag of milk, so-called milk. The purpose of all this was that since there's no more telos in nature, no purpose in nature, Russell says, it's all been replaced by the experts, the managerial society, and the guys like Watson and Pavlov who are going to tell you what reality is. So out with metaphysics, except wait, we're going to give you a new metaphysic, which is radical materialism. Now, Russell admits, by the way, which is surprising, that materialism is a kind of dogma. It's a presupposition, he says. It's not really proven. It's hard to know exactly what we mean when we say that the world is just atomism and materialism. But that's okay, because dogmas no longer matter unless they're the dogmas given by the scientific state. That's what he says. So we are looking at hardcore relativism, hardcore mind control, which he admits numerous times in the book. He says that the state of the future, he's writing in 1931, will be creating GMO babies, boys with titties, girls with, I don't even want to say, gets worse and worse and worse. Test tube babies coming out of test tubes like it's a horror movie. Oh my goodness. The freaks of nature will be designed on purpose. Yes, he says that. All at the service of the scientific state. And that's because, as we said, these heroes of modernity have completely bashed and destroyed all previous ideologies. And guess what? Even though, yes, they used to teach metaphysics and they used to teach theology, Russell says, yeah, we tossed all that out. But yeah, we are going to give you a new metaphysic, and it's called radical materialism. And yeah, it's a metaphysic, but we call it science. It's a presupposition, but we call it science because we say what science is. And that's what's the interesting point in the first half of this book, is in the treatment of the heroes of science, the hall of scientific saints. And in the definitions of science, Russell gives about 30 different conflicting explanations and definitions of what, quote, science is. And that's very important because science is now the new religion. But Russell says this. He says they're the high priests. He says the people in Hollywood and the so-called scientists are the new high priests of the new world order, new world religion. They dictate reality. They dictate truth and falsehood. Now, he's right about that. But again, he has no problem with any of this. He sees himself as simply stating the facts of how societies and cultures and humans evolve. So it's all just perfectly natural because anything that happens is, quote, natural in Russell's view because of deterministic materialism, naturalistic deterministic materialism. The fallacy of the naturalist fallacy, in other words, which is the big critique that we're going to start with when we do the critique of this book. But we have to point out the many multifarious definitions of science and scientific method. Now, science, I believe, and again, I spent a lot of time studying this and grad and undergrad, science is a tool for investigating the natural world. It's a tool for discovering means by which you can create some artifice that will make, life easier. It's a way to discover natural processes, etc., etc. So nobody, I don't think, has any problem with any of that, and everybody knows that this tool works in the same way that a hammer works. It's a tool. But I can't take a hammer, here's a pen, this pen's a tool, and say that the tool shows me the grand narrative of how the world operates and what exists in the world, because it's a tool. It doesn't have the ability to create a grand narrative. It'd be like, pen. Pen is the creator of all. Hail the pen. Look at great pen God. Pen God created all. Right? Nobody would believe that, right? That's absurd. But the exact same thing goes on with Russell when he will say that scientific method is the replacement of providence. He actually says that. So what are all this thing? So he says, let's see, science is just basic empiricism, is one claim. Okay, so science is a specific view of epistemology. Well, first of all, that's not true. Science is not just empiricism, or else any empirical data would be, quote, science, but Russell doesn't believe that. Scientific opinion is one that has reasons. Well, any position can have, any opinion or position can have reasons. So, that's, again, too broad. That could mean anything. The only scientific opinions provide only probable certitudes. Well, the first question I would have is that a probable certitude, or is that absolutely certain? If that's absolutely certain and that's your starting point, then you've already contradicted yourself, because you said that there are no absolute certain starting points. Scientific knowledge is of general laws and facts. Well, that assumes that these general laws and facts actually exist in the external world, which Russell actually later says they do not. They do not actually exist in the world. They are mental human constructs, social constructs. So there's a consistent, you'll notice, confusion between engineering, techne, and science or scientific method. This is a consistent fallacy that these people always engage in, the people that worship scientism. Science is just progress on one point. What does that mean? I thought, by the way, how does quantitative measure give you value judgments? It doesn't. Can't get a value judgment from quantitative measures, right? There's nothing that tells you what's good or bad, or better or lesser, just by having quantities. That assumes some sort of standard by which you can say one thing is good or bad or better or less. Those are metaphysical claims. Sorry. Science is the power of manipulating nature. Well, is that engineering? Because later in the book, he'll actually say that science and engineering aren't strictly exactly the same. Science is merely inductive methodology. Well, I got bad news for Mr. Russell. Anytime you try to do induction, you also necessarily presuppose some aspect of deduction. So there's no such thing as something that's completely inductive. The scientific method is almost omnipotent, he says. Sounds like a religion, doesn't it? This scientific knowledge does not stand alone, but it only exists within the general body of scientific knowledge. Page 37. So actually, there's no such thing as a brute fact. It requires a context to interpret some piece of data. That's a point that I've made countless times. Here's Russell admitting it. But a body of scientific data or opinions, scientific opinion, that's not fact. That's interpretive understanding, unless you've empirically verified what all of the body of scientists believe and say, which is not possible. Then that definition of what science is scientism. It's not actually scientific in its claim. It presupposes metaphysical claims that cannot be verified empirically, which is what we're supposed to believe science is. See? Science is based on the assumptions that are unverifiable, he says, admits at one point. Yes, we agree. Exactly. They're not empirically verifiable, the presuppositions of science, such as the scientific method itself. However, authority in science is not reliable, he later says. And hence the changing opinions of scientists over time. So now, if scientific opinion is not authoritative, then how are we supposed to believe that the assumptions upon which science is based are reliable or true given that they're unverifiable, according to Russell. Again, contradictory. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that I'm an obscurantist or I believe that there's no science. Again, absolutely. What I'm pointing out is that the radical scientism is the presupposition of scientific outlook. I mean, the name of the book tells you that, right? So I am not saying that the scientific method is problematic. It's a method. It's a tool, right? The pen method. The pen method is very useful as a tool for drawing unicorns and drawing mustaches on guys to make them into bad guys or whatever. But that's different from a grand narrative, and that's what this is presenting, a grand materialistic narrative that everything is evolving to a world government. What else is science? Science, unfortunately, he says, is in decay because of radical skepticism, he says, and because of quantum physics. That's a whole other bag. We're not going to get into all that right at this moment, but suffice to say that Russell himself admits that science is in decay. Well, if science is just the things that he's mentioned, basic empiricism, knowledge of universal laws and facts, why would that ever be in decay? If science is engineering and progress in technology, which he seems to say at other times, that's not in decay. No, what he means is that the assumptions of materialism are in decay. That's what he says in that chapter. Geometry has no real relation to the external world. So, moving on towards the end here, what else is science? Science is a systematic pursuit of knowledge. Science is an entire worldview about man and civilizations, page 104. Reason, which is involved in science, is merely a social construct of survival, evolutionary survival mechanism developed in children, 103. Death is merely a positive result of all of the evolutionary processes. Now, why do I say all this? Well, the point is that, here's the crux here. He says, science is all of these things, and many of these things are actually not science. They're different conflicting definitions and dealing with different things like engineering, which is not specifically the scientific method. And in many places, he's admitted that this is actually a philosophy of a grand narrative explanation of reality in the world. It's a metaphysical presupposition, but we don't know anything about metaphysics. That's all been tossed out because that's theology and presupposition that's not empirically verified. The scientific method itself cannot be empirically verified. Now, that's a different, again, Russell admits that. So those of you who are going to reply to me and say that it doesn't matter, we're just trying to be pragmatic. Right, I understand what pragmatism is, but again, I'm telling you that there's a really easy way to refute this, and it's very obvious and very clear. So Russell's very, very adamant that minds and souls and persons don't really exist. They're merely determined chemical reactions. Okay, so free will is an illusion. He's very dogmatic about that. Choice is an illusion. Your creativity is ultimately kind of illusory, right? As is yourself. Well, guess what? If that's the case, and if because of all determined causal reactions, right, everything that I'm saying, everything that I've done is merely a product of mindless, determined causal chains, then Bertrand Russell's book was not the production of the genius of Bertrand Russell. It was merely a chemical reaction of determined mindless process, and it actually tells you nothing about the real world. Now, that's absurd, but that's the conclusion that Russell's book would lead you to on his dogma, and it is a dogma. In fact, he even says that the scientific method ultimately is a kind of specialist mysticism that is hidden and removed from the average man because the average man just can't understand it, and the specialist knows all these things, and he can never ever convey that to the average man, and so therefore the scientific method is the true religion because of the specialists. Now, that's different, though, from the claim that science and the scientific method are just empirical knowledge. It's just empirical observation. It's just knowledge of causal bodies. Knowledge of causal bodies does not tell you that there's no free will, which are all metaphysical claims, and that all of reality is a giant mechanistic determined machine with no free will. You can't, on the one hand, be this skeptic and say that our geometry doesn't tell you anything about the real world, and then turn around and say, well, I know all about the real world. It's all just atoms smashing together. So that's the central transcendental refutation of Russell and scientism, or the naturalistic fallacy, the determinist fallacy, which totally refutes the whole thing. Similar to the problem of Wittgenstein. If words have no meaning, then you just wrote a book destroying the meaning of words, trying to use words conveying meaning, and you failed. So did Bertrand Russell, and that's the number one reason why we know that naturalistic materialism is not true. In the rest of this talk, I will deal with all of the other multitude of claims and the literal genocidal, rabid, savage attitude of anti-human devilry that he spews forth and vomits forth on every freaking page. He's going to predict Monsanto. He's going to say that you're going to eat slop. You're going to eat GMO that's going to give the boys titties. You're going to be born in test tubes. You're going to be killed off. Lenin is the model. Vladimir Lenin is the model for the coming technocrat. They're going to merge capitalism, communism, he says. You're all going to live in communal giant dorms. You're not going to have your own property. Everything's going to be surveilled. It's all in this 1931 book, 2 years prior to Brave New World. So you can hear that at Jay's Analysis. Subscribe for $4.95 a month, $60 a year. We are going to knock down book by book by book by book every one of the globalist top books. Thank you for watching.
Why are you not a Christian?
Because I see no evidence whatever for any of the Christian dogmas. I've examined all the stock arguments in favor of the existence of God, and none of them seem to me to be logically valid.
Do you think there's a practical reason for having a religious belief for many people?
Well, there can't be a practical reason for believing what isn't true. That's quite, at least I rule it out as impossible. Either the thing is true or it isn't. If it is true, you should believe it, and if it isn't, you shouldn't. And if you can't find out whether it's true or whether it isn't, you should suspend judgment. But you can't, it seems to me, a fundamental dishonesty and a fundamental treachery to intellectual integrity to hold a belief because you think it's useful and not because you think it's true.
Well, I was thinking of those people who find that some kind of religious code helps them to live their lives. It gives them a very strict set of rules, the rights and the wrongs.
Yes, but those rules are generally quite mistaken. A great many of them do more harm than good, and they would probably be able to find a rational morality that they could live by if they dropped this irrational, traditional, taboo morality that comes down from savage ages.
But are we, perhaps the ordinary person, perhaps isn't strong enough to find this own personal ethic? They have to have something imposed upon them from outside.
Oh, I don't think that's true. And what is imposed on you from outside is of no value, whatever. Doesn't count.
Well, you were brought up, of course, as a Christian. When did you first decide that you did not want to remain a believer in the Christian ethic?
I never decided that I didn't want to remain a believer. I decided between the ages of 15 and 18, I spent almost all my spare time thinking about Christian dogmas and trying to find out whether there was any reason to believe them. And by the time I was 18, I discarded the last of them.
Do you think that that gave you an extra strength in your life?
Oh, I don't know. No, I shouldn't have said so. Neither extra strength nor the opposite. I mean, I was just engaged in the pursuit of knowledge.
As you approach the end of life, do you have any fear of some kind of afterlife, or do you feel that that is just an impossibility?
No, I think that's nonsense.
There is no afterlife?
None whatever.
Do you have any fear of something that is common amongst atheists and agnostics who have been atheists or agnostics all their lives, who are converted just before they die to a form of religion.
Well, you know, it doesn't happen nearly as often as religious people think it does, because religious people, most of them, think that it's a virtuous act to tell lies about the deathbeds of agnostics and such. As a matter of fact, it doesn't happen very often.
I met Lenin in 1920 when I was in Russia. I had an hour's talk tete-a-tete with him, and he spoke English much better than you would have expected. The whole conversation was in English. I expected it to have been in German, but I found that his English was quite good. I was less impressed by Lenin than I expected to be. He was, of course, a great man. He seemed to me a reincarnation of Cromwell, with exactly the same limitations that Cromwell had. Absolute orthodoxy. He thought a proposition could be proved by quoting a text in Marx. And he was quite incapable of supposing that there could be anything in Marx that wasn't right. And that struck me as rather limited. I disliked one other thing about him, which was his great readiness to stir up hatred. I put certain questions to him to see what his answer would be, and one of them was, you profess to be establishing socialism, but as far as the countryside is concerned, you seem to me to be establishing peasant proprietorship, which is a very different thing from agricultural socialism. And he said, oh, dear me, no, we're not establishing peasant proprietorship. He said, you see, there are poor peasants and rich peasants, and we stirred up the poor peasants against the rich peasants, and they soon hanged them to the nearest tree. Ha, 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 ha. I didn't much like that.
We continue our discussion, and you heard there on those two clips, or you saw them, depending on how you're listening and viewing, the, first of all, statements of atheism and why Bertrand Russell felt there was no evidence for Christianity or for God or for theology, and then a meeting with Lenin. Russell actually went and hung out with Lenin, and that's significant because according to Bertrand Russell, V.I. Lenin is the model of the technocrat. In the future coming world government, the model technocrat is Lenin. Now, that doesn't mean that it will be a Soviet communism. In fact, Russell says that communism and capitalism will need to blend to create a world government. So he's not interested necessarily in a, quote, Soviet system. And in fact, as you heard, he found the character of Lenin to be too dogmatic when it came to Marxist orthodoxy. But for the long-term thinkers like Russell, you have a clear understanding that you could, through many, many decades of social engineering, bring about the alteration of society, in his mind, to fit more in line with the scientific society and the scientific outlook. So as he progresses in the book, as I said, he discusses basically the destruction in the first half of the book of the old order. So roughly chapters 1 to 5 deal with the end of theology, the end of metaphysics, the end of things like the soul, the mind, free will. All those things have been completely dismantled by, quote, science. Now, how exactly were they dismantled by science? Well, they weren't proven non-existent, but the heroes of science just became so popular and so powerful that no one needed, so he says, right, the ideas of God or the soul or the soul. Now, that's not actually true. That's just the dogmatic proclamation that these things are done and gone. We don't believe those things anymore. We don't need them anymore. We've moved on. That's his claim. Now, as we said in the first section, this is all, of course, based on empiricism, naive, radical empiricism. And that's, of course, the position that all knowledge comes to us through just merely sense data. And we are just human video recorders that record sense data. And then the mind somehow kind of places this into some coherent order and interprets the data, and we spit that back out in our mouths and in our interpretive frameworks, which are social constructs, evolutionary constructs. And man himself is now the focus of man's worldview, as Russell says, and so man has now become God. In the place of the older theological ideas, everything is at the service of man, and as a result, man has turned against man, because the evolutionary philosophy here dictates that some thus are more evolved than others. And as a result of some being more evolved, and because of the dictates of Malthus and David Ricardo and Adam Smith, whom he mentions, by the way, in Social Darwinism, it's therefore incumbent upon scientific method and the scientific state, those who are advanced in their IQs, to regulate and to sterilize and to put to death those who do not fit the higher species unless they are useful for slave labor. So, because all of the older questions of God and the external world and the questions of philosophy, that all ended in total skepticism and solipsism. Yes, that's what Russell says on page 76. We just don't care about that anymore. It doesn't matter. And all that matters is pragmatism, what works. Pure will to power. Excuse me, that's explicitly his terms, by the way. That's not me imposing that interpretation upon him. And he goes on to say that as a result of all these changes, and as we move into the second chunk of the book, the war machine has sped up evolution. The need for technological dominance in warfare has propelled men to get their butts to work on creating all of these crazy technologies, complex bombs, things like the internet eventually, the wireless, which in his day he's talking about radio, and so forth and so on, all of which are propelled by the war machine. And out of this we get the ideas of progress. So progress is in some way intimately tied to technology and techne, and this is again one of those confusions that we mentioned earlier on, where metallurgy is science and scientific technique, but yet engineering is not strictly the same thing as science and scientific technique. So we're never exactly told what clearly the difference is, but we're also told that reason is a evolutionary social construct. And he thinks that Jean Piaget is right, that children have developed this evolutionary construct just to get along in the world. And these technological advances, which do come about largely, he says, from private industry, these are dangerous because they will lead to things like peak oil and environmental catastrophes. So here's one of the pioneers of environmentalism, I bet you didn't know that, in 1931, saying that oil and the chasing after resources will lead to giant civilizational collapse. The forests are being cut down. So here's your Amazon rainforest fear. And he says, as a result, scientific technique will solve all these problems which are made up problems largely, by the way. We know that the Club of Rome said that. The Club of Rome said that man is the problem, and that would be an invention of the pundits, the role of the Club of Rome, that they would use pollution as the justification for the giant environmental agenda. That's all right here in pages 108, 109, 1010 by Bertrand Russell. So here's Russell. What Club of Rome is the first global revolution, right? How many? That's 70s, 80s, 90s, somewhere in there. I know there's two different limits to growth, and then there's the first global revolution, and so those are two different publications, a decade or two apart. Well, here's Russell, 50, 60 years ahead of that. He also says that weather control, weather modification, terraforming will be a big part of solving the supposed environmental disasters of man, and that this is the great work. The great work is the perfecting of the flawed creation. Page 110. Mechanistic fanatics will control the future, and they will fix broken nature. And the usefulness of capitalism and big business and monopoly capitalism comes into play precisely here, because it will give all the mechanisms by which the scientific elite will control the future. So that does not mean that capitalism will go into the future. Capitalism will be tossed away once it has given the mechanization and the means by which the global government can get going. Then he goes on to talk about pesticides and biowarfare and the advances that will be made through things like Monsanto. And again, I tweeted that out. That got a lot of shares and retweets. He predicts Monsanto. He predicts that there will be synthetic foods that the elites will eat. And this is on page 120. And he says that you will eat the slop. You will eat the GMO slop. The elite will eat real steaks. So there you go, vegans, by the way. Veganism is part of this. That's why you're getting all the synthetic meat coming out of the vegan circles. They're pushing for this. But it's interesting that he says that the elites will study blights and biowarfare, and as a result, they'll have the solutions to all kinds of genetic problems. In other words, they might actually create the genetic problems because they'll also have the solutions to the biowarfare and GMO problems. They will have mastered breeding science such that the synthetic overlay, you've heard me talk about this before, I wasn't making that up. This is mentioned explicitly on pages 118 to 19 of Bertrand Russell, is that the elite will continue to live a normal organic existence while the rest of the society will be forced into the synthetic overlay. And this is not just something like eating GMOs. He's saying this is the entire biosphere. The entire biosphere will participate in this modification. But it's basically a giant test tube, a giant lab experiment. And the populations are going to be the experiment, not the elites. The elites are going to, be eating their steaks and enjoying their life, while the populations as a whole will participate in various experiments. So government spraying you, corporations testing things on you, all that may sound far-fetched, even though there have been countless even mainstream news articles about that kind of stuff. If you think that's far-fetched, well, here's Bertrand Russell saying that this stuff will go on. That's all in Chapter 8. Chapter 9 is about man's physiology. He says in the future, DNA and genetics will determine whether you're born or not, what races, what numbers will be allowed for various races. No longer will blind force be in charge of who's born and who's not, but rather controlled by a centralized global government that will be fiercely run by eugenics, and in this case he means explicitly dysgenics, and he says children will basically be lab rats. This is on page 126. There will be Island of Dr. Moreau hybrids. There will be geniuses bred for genius work and dumb slaves bred for dumb slave work out of test tubes. Literal Island of Dr. Moreau. So this is where, he and H.G. Wells together, I guess, right? We're kind of probably feeding off of one another. And this book is Brave New World. This book is H.G. Wells. He says that the Jesuit methods of psychology and mind control, basically, will be used ultimately in the world government. Now, why does he say that? Well, he says that the Catholic Church was a great model of how to erect a global government. But of course, he does not believe that the morality of the church, with its anti-abortion and anti-birth control stances, will fit with the New World Order. But what he's saying, he says that Roman Catholicism is a type of, or a model of, how the global government could be constructed. So that's what he's talking about. And these world controllers will be kind of like the Jesuits that go around and kind of control things, but it will in many ways be structured like a hierarchy in a secret society. And again, this is what we read in Anglo-American Establishment, right? The inner party, the outer party. That is exactly what he's talking about here. It will be run on the basis of Freud. I guess he's living still at a time when no one had thought to question Freud, although Freud is not really in favor anymore, supposedly. He's saying that the global government will be run by Freudian tricks and motivations of base desires through advertising and Hollywood. And J.B. Watson's behaviorism. Watson and Pavlov and Freud behaviorism will be the basis for the operant conditioning. This is a technique that will be based, as I've said many times, here he says it explicitly, Malthus and I thought he mentioned, yes, he mentions Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Malthus. Yes, from Malthus to Darwin, David Ricardo, Adam Smith. This is pages 136, 137. So, advertising will play largely in the future, he says, which is very prophetic. Education, he says, will become pure socialization, has nothing to do with teaching you truths or facts or telling you how to learn or to study or to research. Education will be completely socialized conditioning. Mass media and Hollywood will play a huge role in conditioning the society as a whole, pages 142 to 143. Hollywood and the social scientists are the new high priests of the new religion, page 143. Movies will be a drug for the masses to keep them entertained. The nations, people who will retain the ideas of nationalism will be considered evil. Russell actually says they're evil. And anyone who wants to have gold, he says, is evil. And by the way, here's a point I've often said, is that as a medieval peasant, you would have more freedom than you do in today's so-called free world. Russell says that, page 145. He says the peasant, compared to the person who will grow up in the scientific global government, will have more freedom than the global government slave. But the global government slave will think that he's completely free because he's free to become a tranny and to have sex with pigs and dogs and dragons and unicorns. The end of the nation state will be mandated and all borders will be opened. Page 146. By the way, if as a total relativist, why is it that Bertrand Russell feels the need to see this world order foisted upon all the world. Why is this Anglo-liberal view, quote, good, in the sense of needing to be foisted upon the whole world? I thought you don't believe in metaphysical principles and that science can't give you values. So if science can't give you values, why does this plan need to be enforced upon everybody? Well, that's because he's not interested in being consistent. This is a scam. He says that this is a point I've made countless times. The revolutions from the Enlightenment and then the political revolutions of the French Revolution, he says that was all kicking off what would become the scientific society. The American Revolution was an early beta attempt at a scientific society, but he says Jefferson and Robespierre could never come up with what will be the technocratic global government. He says that on page 150. Let me stress that again, libertarians out there, anarcho-capitalists out there, hear me. Jefferson and Robespierre, although they attempted to create scientific governments, rational governments, were behind the times. They were not real technocrats. But the revolution that they kicked off will end in transhumanism, page 151. And the technocratic society will be completely planned communities. Yes, planned communities. Now, there's a weird section in pages 152 to 153 where Russell discusses the Western influence in Asia, and that this was actually exported to Asia to destroy Japan. He says that this was an experiment in Japan, and that the Soviet exportation of the ideology was a scientific experiment. Pages 152, 3, 4. And yes, he says the future New World Order will basically be an oligarchic-run Soviet shadow empire that's global. It will not be Russian necessarily in that sense of Soviet, but rather Soviet in the sense of the way that was an experiment in that country, and it will lead to the end of all nation states. He says there will be created some kind of giant Pacific Rim style bot. There'll be like a giant war bot, machine bot that the global government will possess that no one will be able to defeat, and sterilization will be offered for credits, and if you take the sterilization, you can have sex with whoever you want, and there will be copious amounts of sports. Sports will take over for the older ideas of revolutions against government, and the sports and the food will create a docile, retarded public who can only speak Pidgin and Esperanto. And if you've seen the BBC recently, they now offer Pidgin as an option. Yes, that's right, Pidgin, to destroy language. I am not joking. Go look up the BBC Pidgin articles. So he said that the original attempts at revolutionary scientific societies at the time of Locke and those characters in Rousseau, they merely wanted life, liberty, and equality. He says, but that doesn't really work, and what that does is that it eventually leads to a society that's based around no freedom, run by an oligarchy. And he says it only took a few generations to get from Locke and Rousseau to where we are now and where we're going. And again, how many times have I told you this? For how many years now and how many podcasts? And that's because I learned this at college. I learned that when I was reading all the medievalists who were actually a lot more coherent in their philosophy of social order than these characters, I started realizing that the medieval organizations of society were actually a lot more healthy and organic than the revolutionary ideas of the organizations of society. So, and Bertrand Russell says that, by the way, too. He says that eventually the scientific state will figure out how to get women out of the house. Feminism will be promoted in 162. This will lead to communal living in giant halls and dorms. So basically we're all going to live in a target city or like a college campus right above a Starbucks. There will not be freedoms in this society. Children will be regulated. You might not even be allowed to have children. The state might decide that you're both to be sterilized. There will be no waste because there won't be any free enterprise. So austerity. Population will be controlled. Infanticide will be introduced by the superstate to control levels of population for what's sustainable. Again, this is all 1931, way ahead of the Club of Rome. It will be a world order. He said it will be tyrannical. There won't be equality or liberty. He says because the scientific state is not interested in equality or liberty. So the Masonic tales that you were told at the time of the French Revolution of liberty, equality, and fraternity, just like Aldous Huxley says, that was just a trick to get you to opt into revolutionary philosophy, which within a couple centuries would lead to the global government. And again, you think that's too far-fetched? No. The guys, the Masons of 300-400 years ago were saying there would be a global government. This is what Adam Weishaupt said, right? So it's the same philosophy, okay? It's not, in other words, Bertrand Russell is outlining the same thing as Adam Weishaupt. So this is the real Illuminism. And it's communism, but it's not communism like you think of, like Marx fighting the capitalists. No, they don't have a problem with capitalism. It's scientific socialism monitored or ruled by a kind of fascist corporatism above that. And that's what he says more or less on page 167. And it's structured like a hierarchy, he says, like the Jesuit order or the Catholic Church. That's literally what he says on page 167. He says, in the scientific government, it will be a complete technocracy where GMOs and clones will determine births. Yes, they're going to clone fetuses. This is what he says on page 169. But don't worry, it'll be a utopia because there won't be any anarchy. So you'll all be drugged, and that's why you'll be happy. So it's a utopia because you're forcibly drugged, forcibly made happy. Literally, I'm not imposing that upon the text. That's what he says. He says, and we need more characters like V.I. Lenin. Right? V.I. Lenin is the future of the technocracy. Lenin himself, as you heard earlier, he was not that impressed with that guy. But what he's saying is that type of dude is who's going to run the global government. He says that the main enemy to this progress, quote unquote, pages 172 and 173, is Christianity. Christianity, traditional religion, are the main enemies because they hold out a morality that conflicts with the morality, quote unquote, the will to power of the superstate, the technocratic state. He says that humans individually will come to be viewed as cancer cells on the body politic unless they go along with the global government. We're already hearing this now, right? That humans are cancer upon the face of Mother Earth and this kind of stuff. Also, by the way, this is interesting. He says anybody who tries to retain national identity will be put to death. He says that there will be future world wars, which will lead to more centralization and global government. So there's proof, by the way, that the world wars of the last century were precisely for the purpose of global government. Russell says that, page 174 and 75. And then he says about also, by the way, what's the term that I think Corbett did the show on, kakistocracy, right? Like profiling the worst to be put in charge. That's what Russell says, page 175. He says the society of experts will profile, define, through tests, through IQs, and through willpower, tests of will, who are to be the future psychopathic leaders. He says this will be a government that promotes democracy, but is actually a shadow government. It's run by an oligarchy. Page 175. It's not really democracy, but it puts on the face of democracy. Leaving the forms of democracy intact, it will actually be run by a shadow government. He predicts that there will be less white people in the future. He says, and if that happens, then what will probably be the case is that China will take over to run the New World Order. Yes, he says that. He says France and Europe will become third world cesspools, and they'll become like Haiti, and China will have to take up the baton of the New World Order. 177. The New World Order utopia will be efficient. There will be no private enterprise, no private business, because that leads to upsetting the system. It's not totally controlled, and it leads to waste, and we can't have any waste. We got to have austerity. He also says that the UN Security Council will be created because of the, quote, atomic bomb. That's interesting because this is written prior to the UN. He mentions the League of Nations, but he foresees that global government will be erected on the auspices of the atomic bomb. That's exactly what Quigley said about Bernard Baruch, didn't he? If you heard the Tragedy and Hope lectures. False scarcity. Now, I'm saying false scarcity because Russell has been telling you that, big oil, like fossil fuels are going to run out, and that this will lead to giant world wars because there's no oil, which I think that peak oil was a scam, by the way, by the big oil companies. But Russell says that the wars for resources will lead to giant environmental engineering. Interesting. Chapter 15, he says that normies, if you heard people joking about this term, right? Normies, we all know normies. People who just want to be normal, right? Baby boomers, people that just want to fit in. They don't want to rock the boat, don't want to be seen as weird, don't want to be seen as believing anything out of line with whatever the prevailing consensus is. Russell says that those people are created by design. Now, to some degree, right, there have always been people who, the masses and people who go along to get along. But what's interesting about this quote on page 181 is that he says, we will specifically engineer everyone except for the chosen managerial technocrat class to be normies. This is one of the most amazing chapters in the book, chapter 15, because of what it says. He says that the normies are going to be engineered to be docile, punctual, free of thought, and content. So there's your Joe Sixpack and Mama Soccer Mom. Mama Soccer Mom. They will not be given hardly any book learning. The reading will be discouraged. Boy, has that come true. They will be punished for having initiative. Wow. They will be told to follow everybody else. The main lesson that they'll be taught in grade school is to cooperate. They'll be assigned a trade, and they will be taught through some kind of communal national education board that will broadcast to the whole country. So here's your educational standards crap, right? Common Core and your Board of Education and all that. But standardization of education, basically, is what Russell says here. This will all be engineered by the control group. He says that they will breed the alphas to do alpha work, and that this whole structure is military, will be a giant military structure. The masses are going to be given perpetual amusements. The arts will not be allowed. He's not talking about degenerate arts will be allowed. Absolutely. Those are called the talkies, right? The pop music and the Hollywood garbage. Those are the lowbrow stuff for social engineering. Russell says, when he says no arts, he specifically says, we will not allow you to read Shakespeare. You will not read any highbrow stuff. That will all be discouraged. And he literally says that. He says Shakespeare will be forbidden in the global government. This comes up in Brave New World, by the way. If you remember I've included this in my book, right? The discussions of Mustafa Mond about metaphysics and arts and so forth. And this is explicitly stated on page 185. Russell says, people will make discoveries and they'll figure out at times that the prevailing materialist dogma is not true. He says, but they will be punished and discouraged by their professors. Boy, isn't that true. He says, if the smart rebels don't go along, they'll just have to be put to death. That's page 185. He says that these two classes in this Brave New World will be divided up like Eloi and Morlocks. Now, he doesn't say Eloi and Morlocks, but I'm saying that's exactly what H.G. Wells was talking about. He says they will eventually evolve into two different species, page 188. Literally says two different species. He says that the main obstacle will be Christianity. The state will determine the child policies. There will no longer be natural births, and he says that you'll be made fun of if you have a natural birth. It'll be viewed as unladylike to have a natural birth, and people will look down on you, like they'll snub their noses at you. He says fatherhood will come to an end. The idea of fatherhood, fathers will have nothing to do with their children. Page 190. This will be the end of the family, and as a result, he says, over time, this will also lead to the death of motherhood, which won't matter because by that time, the children will just come directly from the test tubes and they won't even need the womb anymore. Love, since it has no place in science, and affection will be ended. All private affections will be viewed as unfortunate because the whole of life will be devoted to the business of science. He says, however, when it comes to the masses, there will be the promotion of free love and sexual revolution, page 192, because of the fact that sex has been divorced from reproduction. That's what Bertrand Russell says. Now, as a result of all that, you might be thinking, well, this is just too much. I mean, surely he doesn't. Well, here Bertrand Russell at the end tries to play the nice guy and say, well, yes, this is all kind of dismal, and he says on page 96 that, yeah, it's all pragmatism and it's all the philosophy of Heraclitus, flux, all is flux. And he even mentions Satan. He says it may even seem like this is satanic. He says, yeah, science will become sadistic, but, this is just the way of the world, right? I mean, in other words, if everything is just part of this evolutionary process, then the giant scientific superstate is itself just part of the evolutionary process. Just natural. It's just natural to do all this because anything that happens is therefore, quote, natural. So what does he say? Well, maybe we can have a little bit of tradition. I'm not joking. He says this on pages 201 to 202. Maybe we can find a little bit of value in something like the arts, or there's something somewhere we can come up with some value or some kind of emotional attachment. Otherwise, this will just be too bleak. But he says you will have to lose your individualism. Sorry, you won't be able to have an identity in this order. But, maybe we can come up with some kind of scientific manipulation of emotion that will make you happy. So he says that's the only hope is that science can also provide some kind of soma, I guess. And, one or two people, or you might be able to have allowed to keep in your mind a couple traditional ideas. He says on page 201 and 202. So that's just to give you some idea of some value without being completely nihilistic, because the society won't be able to function if it's totally nihilistic, which is interesting, right? So what do we have there? Well, we have all the admissions of the stuff that I've been talking about for years. I've read sections of this book and the other book, Impact of Science on Society, over the years. When I was about 20 as an undergrad, you'll be introduced to Bertrand Russell. At that time, I was studying a lot of apologetics, so I read his anti-Christian book, Why I'm Not a Christian. And that book is interesting because it's a lot of logical fallacies, actually. He says a lot of things like, the only people who would believe this are weak people. Well, that's actually what's called an emotional appeal. And an emotional appeal is a fallacy in logic because the argument is not sound, right? In other words, saying that someone is weak, even if that's true or not, really has nothing to do with the truth or falsity of the position itself, right? So in other words, it's a kind of trick where you're appearing to make your position sound like the only one that, quote, strong people would adopt. And, well, everybody wants to be a strong person, right? Nobody wants to be weak. So, but that's not a valid argument. But that's consistently the kind of thing that you see in Why I'm Not a Christian. So it's just ironic to me that guy is propped up as the greatest logician, Nobel Prize winner, and all that. But of course, we who study this stuff really in depth, we know that Russell was working intimately with the OSS. He was a propagandist in all these BBC articles. He's traveling, meeting with V.I. Lenin. He is working with the Frankfurt School with Rockefeller money. So definitely, I mean, he's kind of the Neil deGrasse Tyson of his day, much like H.G. Wells was, right? These are the same circles. And you'll notice a lot of the H.G. Wells science fiction, right, is literally the Bertrand Russell stuff. So whether Bertrand is borrowing from Wells or Wells borrowing from Russell and vice versa, doesn't really matter because it's all the same propaganda, right? And that's the point, is that, it's not Barack Obama that was the first Nobel Prize fraud. You can go back to Bertrand Russell, who's given this because of presumably, his status within Fabian Society, within his Royal Society contacts and so forth, and because he's a propagandist for the global government. That's why. So that is Scientific Outlook. Thank you for listening. I don't know if we'll do, I might need a break from Bertrand Russell, so we might do an H.G. Wells book next, either Open Conspiracy or New World Order. I've read a couple chapters of both of those. They won't be too long. They're pretty quick books. And then we've got some Jonas Salk and some Jacques Attali, and a lot of these globalist characters who lay it all out. But, this book is pretty amazing. I mean, every page, I have notes on every single page. And you're getting admission after admission after admission within 200 pages. This is a 202-page book. So thank you for listening to the critique of the Scientific Outlook, which, if to sum up, is really just the Scientism Outlook, right? The Scientism Outlook propaganda book. Thank you.